My husband didn't run to me. That's the detail I keep coming back to even now. I was face down on our kitchen floor, my left arm pinned under my chest, and I couldn't move my legs. Didn't want to. Couldn't. I remember the linoleum was cold against my cheek. I remember staring at the baseboard and thinking, that corner has dust on it. I need to clean that corner. Your brain does strange things when it's terrified. He walked in from the garage and stood there for a second. I heard him set his keys on the counter. Then he said, "Seriously, Iris, again?" That was it. That was the first thing out of his mouth. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Oh my God." Just, again. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without the year that came before it. My husband and I had been married for 4 years when things started getting strange. I was 31. I worked as a patient billing coordinator at a mid-sized orthopedic clinic in Columbus. We had a 2-bedroom house in Westerville, a used Subaru I loved too much, and a joint savings account that I contributed to more than he did, but never said anything about because I didn't want to be that kind of wife. I had a full benefits package through work, medical, dental, vision. I was, by any reasonable measure, a healthy adult woman with a stable life. The first time it happened, I thought I'd slept wrong. I woke up on a Tuesday in October, and my right hand was tingling. Not the pins and needles you get when your arm falls asleep, but a deep, buzzing numbness that ran from my fingers to my elbow. I shook it out. It went away by the time I finished my coffee. I didn't mention it to anyone. The second time, my vision blurred during a work call. Not dramatically. Just soft around the edges for a minute, like someone had smudged the air. I blinked it away. I made a mental note to schedule an eye exam. The third time, I dropped a full mug of coffee. It just fell out of my hand. I was standing still, not moving, and my fingers simply stopped holding it. My husband's name is Owen. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party when I was 26, moved in together after 8 months, got married in the backyard of his parents' house in Guyana. He's tall, quiet in the way people mistake for thoughtful, and very good at seeming reasonable. I want you to hold on to that word, seeming. When I started mentioning the symptoms, Owen had a way of responding that I can only describe as deflecting without technically dismissing. He'd tilt his head and say things like, "You do push yourself really hard," or "Have you been drinking enough water?" Once he said, "You've always been kind of anxious, babe." He said it gently, like he was doing me a favor. I started to wonder if he was right. That's the thing about gaslighting that no one tells you. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like a slow correction. Like being nudged, 1 centimeter at a time, toward a version of yourself that doubts everything. By January, 3 months in, I had a running list of symptoms on my phone: tingling in my hands and feet, occasional vision blur, fatigue that felt different from tired, heavier, like something sitting on my chest. Once, a 30-second episode where my left leg just stopped cooperating when I stood up from my desk. I went to my primary care doctor, Alvarez, who is kind and thorough and who I trust. She ran blood work. Everything came back normal. Could be stress, she said. Could be early signs of a lot of things. Let's monitor it. I told Owen about the appointment. He nodded and said, "See, nothing to worry about." And I almost let myself believe that. The symptoms kept coming. By spring, I had started keeping track of something else, when the symptoms were worst. I'm not sure why I started doing it. Some part of me that still had instincts, maybe. I noticed they tended to spike in the evenings, usually after I'd been home for a while. Usually after dinner. Owen had, about 6 months earlier, developed what he called a tea ritual. He read some article about gut health, and suddenly there was a whole shelf in our kitchen dedicated to loose-leaf teas, a fancy kettle, a little strainer. He made it every night, 1 for him, 1 for me. It was, honestly, one of the more considerate things he'd done in our marriage. I thought it was sweet. I told my co-worker Addie about it and she said, "That's actually kind of romantic." I drank my tea every night for 8 months. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 8 months. The week before I ended up on the kitchen floor, I'd had what I now understand was a significant escalation. I woke up Thursday morning and couldn't feel my feet, not briefly, for 45 minutes. I sat on the edge of the bed, flexing my toes, watching them move while feeling nothing, and I cried, quietly, so Owen wouldn't hear from the shower. I had gotten very good at crying quietly. I called out of work that day. I spent most of it on the couch, and by afternoon the feeling had come back and I told myself it was fine. It was fine. It was fine. That Friday night, Owen's company hosted a little end-of-quarter thing at a local bar. We went together. I had one drink, over the course of 3 hours. I was tired. I wanted to go home. Saturday morning, I was making breakfast. Owen was outside with the neighbor, something about a lawn mower. I reached into the cabinet for a bowl and my left hand didn't close properly around it. The bowl hit the counter edge and shattered. I bent down to pick up the pieces and that's when my legs went. Not gradually. All at once. I was on the floor before I understood I was falling. And I couldn't get up. I tried. I kept trying. I was there for maybe 4 minutes before Owen came inside. You already know what he said. He did eventually call 911, but not immediately. There was a moment. I was still on the floor, my cheek still against the linoleum, where he stood over me and said, "You need to calm down, you're going to be fine," with this particular flatness in his voice that I had never heard before. Like he was reciting something, like he was in a play and slightly bored by his own lines. The paramedics were there within 8 minutes. There were 2 of them, a younger man named Eddie who was all business and speed, and a woman, slightly older, who crouched down and put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Hi, honey, I've got you." And I burst into tears the second she touched me, the kind of tears that have been building for a long time. She did a quick neurological assessment right there on my kitchen floor, checked my reflexes, asked me to push against her hands with my feet, checked my grip strength. She asked the standard questions: any medications, any recent illness, any changes in diet or routine. I said, "I've been having these symptoms for months." My husband thought it was stress. She didn't look at Owen. She just kept her eyes on me and said, "When did the symptoms first start?" Owen answered for me. "She's always been anxious," he said. "She has a tendency to—" "Sir, I'm asking her," the paramedic said. Her voice was pleasant. Her eyes were not. She made a decision right there, I think. I don't know what she noticed. I don't know if it was his tone or the kitchen or me, my weight loss maybe. I hadn't registered that I'd lost almost 11 pounds since October. Later, she told investigators it was a combination of the symptom pattern and what she described as the relational dynamic in the room. She'd been a paramedic for 11 years. Before the ambulance left, she stepped back inside the house, said she'd forgotten something, and had a quiet conversation with a police officer who had arrived on scene. I didn't know that until later. At the hospital, things moved fast. The ER physician ordered a full metabolic panel, a neurological workup, and something called a heavy metal screening, the last one based on notes from the paramedic's report. I didn't even know that was a test you could order. I thought heavy metal screening was for industrial workers, for people who handled chemicals. Not for a 31-year-old billing coordinator from Westerville who drank herbal tea every night. The results that mattered came back the next morning. Elevated arsenic levels, not trace amounts, not the kind you get from well water or certain foods, the kind that indicates repeated exposure over an extended period of time. The attending physician came in and sat down, which is how you know it's serious. He explained what the levels meant. He explained the symptom pattern: peripheral neuropathy, the tingling, the muscle weakness, the visual disturbances. He said that with consistent low-level exposure over months, the damage accumulates gradually, which is why it can be mistaken for anxiety, fatigue, early MS, half a dozen other things. I listened to all of this. I nodded. And then I said, "The tea." He paused. "Tell me about the tea." Owen was arrested 43 hours after I was admitted. I want to be honest about what those 43 hours were like because I think people expect that moment of revelation to feel clarifying. Like everything snapping into focus, it didn't feel like that. It felt like being underwater. Like someone had told me that gravity had been working differently this whole time and I just hadn't known. My sister Margot drove up from Cincinnati the morning after I was admitted. She arrived at 6 a.m. with a bag of clothes for me and a look on her face that I recognized from childhood, the one she gets when she's furious but holding it together for someone else. She sat in the hospital chair and held my hand and didn't say, "I told you so," even though she'd had reservations about Owen from the beginning that I'd never let her finish expressing. My parents took longer to understand. My mum, especially. She kept saying, "But why?" Not rhetorically, but genuinely, desperately. She wanted a reason that made sense. So did I. The investigation turned up the following. Owen had been purchasing arsenic trioxide through a dark net supplier, paid for using a separate cash card he'd been loading at a Kroger self-checkout since the previous August. He'd been adding small amounts to my tea, not enough to cause a dramatic episode, just enough, over time. The forensic toxicologist explained it as an escalating microdosing pattern, starting low to avoid detection, gradually increasing as tolerance levels were established. He was also, it turned out, the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy he'd taken out on me 14 months earlier, a policy I had signed paperwork for. I found this out later, during a session of document signing that Owen had described to me as refinancing paperwork. I had been tired. I hadn't read it carefully. I had trusted him. The policy was for $600,000. The trial was 8 months later. I won't go through all of it because some of it is still too raw and some of it is genuinely boring in the way legal proceedings are. A lot of waiting, a lot of paperwork, a lot of moments where the enormity of what happened to you gets reduced to exhibits and line items and objections sustained. What I will tell you is that the paramedic, her name is Renee, testified. She sat in the stand and explained quietly and precisely everything she had observed and why it had concerned her. When the defense attorney tried to suggest she'd overstepped, she said, "I've seen what neglect looks like and I've seen what harm looks like. They feel different in a room." The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Owen was convicted on 1 count of attempted murder and 1 count of insurance fraud. He was sentenced to 22 years. Here is what recovery looks like and what no one prepares you for. It is not linear. It is not a montage. It is not the scene in the movie where the determined woman takes her first step and the music swells. The first 2 weeks in the hospital, I slept more than I was awake. The chelation therapy, which is how you treat arsenic poisoning, for anyone who didn't know, I certainly didn't, is exhausting in a way that goes beyond physical. My body was working to undo 8 months of damage. There were days I cried for no reason, and days I felt nothing at all, and days I was furious in a way that had nowhere to go. But then, week 3, I stood up with a walker and took 5 steps. And the next day, 12. And the day after that, I made it to the end of the hallway and back. My physical therapist's name was Marcus, and he had the particular gift of knowing when to push and when to just walk beside you quietly. On the day I made it outside for the first time, just to the little courtyard in the hospital, he didn't say anything. He just held the door open, and when I got through it, he nodded like I'd done something ordinary. I think that was the kindest thing anyone did for me that whole month. I left the hospital on a Thursday in late September. Margot drove me back to her place in Cincinnati, not to our house in Westerville. I never went back to that house. My name was on the mortgage too, and eventually it was dealt with through the legal process, but I never spent another night there. I have been asked, since all of this, whether there were signs I missed. Yes, objectively, yes, but I also want to push back on that framing a little because the question implies that if I had been smarter or more observant, this wouldn't have happened, and that's not quite right. Owen was deliberate. He managed the information I had access to. He shaped the story I told myself about my own health. He had help from the fact that women in their 30s who present with vague neurological symptoms are, statistically, often told it's anxiety. The medical system and Owen's behavior were operating in the same direction. What I will say is this: my body knew before my mind did. Every time I pushed away that uneasy feeling, every time I accepted the explanation that I was being dramatic or anxious or too sensitive, I was working against something real that my body was already trying to tell me. If you are reading this and something feels wrong, even if everyone around you is saying you're fine, please go to a doctor. Go by yourself if you have to. Bring your list. Be specific. Ask for a second opinion. Do not let someone else narrate your symptoms for you. That's not a dramatic lesson. It's just the thing I wish someone had told me 2 Octobers ago, standing in my kitchen watching coffee spread across the floor from a mug I couldn't hold. I'm back in Columbus now, in an apartment I chose by myself for the first time in 5 years. It's a 1-bedroom in the short north with windows that face east, which means I wake up to actual sunlight, which I did not realize I had been missing. I have a job I mostly like and a sister who texts me too often and a savings account that is just mine. There are still days when my hands tingle. The neurologist says it may take another full year for the peripheral neuropathy to fully resolve, possibly longer. I do physical therapy twice a week. I'm careful now in ways I didn't used to be. I got a new kettle last spring. Electric, brushed steel, nothing fancy. I make my own tea. I know exactly what's in it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since everything happened. Not in a cosmic sense. I don't think the universe was punishing Owen or rewarding me. I think it's simpler and, in some ways, more unsettling than that. I think people's choices accumulate. Every small cruelty, every calculated lie, every moment Owen chose his plan over my life. Those choices didn't disappear. They built something, and eventually, what they built became impossible to hide. That's what I mean when I say there's a logic to how this ended. Not magic, just consequence. Owen spent months being very careful and very precise, and in the end it was his own behavior in that kitchen, the flatness in his voice, the way he didn't move toward me, the words he chose that put Renee on alert. He'd practiced so many things, but he hadn't practiced looking like a husband who was scared for his wife. Because he wasn't one. And that absence showed. The thing I keep returning to, the thing I want to say carefully because I don't want it to sound like I'm blaming myself, is that intelligence isn't just about knowing facts. It's about trusting the information you already have. I had data, months and months of it, in my body, in my notes app, in the pattern I half noticed and then talked myself out of. I was smart enough to keep the list. I wasn't yet wise enough to believe it fully. There's a difference, and that difference cost me almost a year of my health. What I know now, on the other side of it, is that your instincts are a form of intelligence. Not infallible, not always right, but worth taking seriously. Worth bringing to a doctor. Worth saying out loud. The version of me who cried quietly, so Owen wouldn't hear. She was protecting herself from something, and I wish she'd understood sooner that the thing she needed protection from was already inside the house. Margot always knew something was wrong. She never had proof. She just knew. I used to find that kind of intuition unscientific, almost irritating. I understand it differently now. She was reading information I wasn't letting myself read. And Renee, a woman who spent 11 years walking into the worst moments of strangers' lives, she read it in about 4 minutes. There's a kind of intelligence that comes from paying attention without needing someone to confirm what you're seeing. I want to be more like that. I'm working on it. What I'm trying to build now, in this east-facing apartment with the morning light and the kettle I chose myself, is a life that belongs entirely to me. That sounds simple. It isn't. After years of having your perception managed by someone else, learning to trust your own read on things is daily, unglamorous work. Some days I'm better at it than others, but I get up. I go to physical therapy. I make my tea. I notice what I feel and I believe it. That's not a triumphant ending. It's just an honest one. And after everything, honest is the thing I want most.